Chapter 47 of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 47. Mr. Ralph Nickleby has some confidential intercourse with another old friend. They concert between them a project which promises well for both. "There go the 3/4 past," muttered Newman Noggs, listening to the chimes of some neighbouring church. "And my dinner times too. He does it on purpose. He makes a point of it. It's just like him." It was in his own little den of an office, and on the top of his official stool, that Newman thus soliloquized. And the soliloquy referred, as Newman's grumbling soliloquies usually did, to Ralph Nickleby. "I don't believe he ever had an appetite," said Newman, "except for pounds, shillings, and pence, and with them he's as greedy as a wolf. I should like to have him compelled to swallow one of every English coin. The penny would be an awkward morsel, but the crown—" His good humour being in some degree restored by the vision of Ralph Nickleby swallowing perforce a 5-shilling piece, Newman slowly brought forth from his desk one of those portable bottles, currently known as pocket pistols, and shaking the same close to his ear so as to produce a rippling sound very cool and pleasant to listen to, suffered his features to relax and took a gurgling drink, which relaxed them still more. Replacing the cork, he smacked his lips twice or thrice with an air of great relish, and, the taste of the liquor having by this time evaporated, recurred to his grievance again. 5 minutes to 3, growled Newman. "It can't want more by this time. And I had me breakfast at 8 o'clock, and such a breakfast, and my right dinner time too. And I might have a nice little bit of hot roast meat, spoiling at home all this time. How does he know I haven't? Don't go till I come back. Don't go till I come back. Day after day. What do you always go out at my dinner time for then, eh? Don't you know it's nothing but aggravation, eh?" These words, though uttered in a very loud key, were addressed to nothing but empty air. The recital of his wrongs, however, seemed to have the effect of making Newman Noggs desperate, for he flattened his old hat upon his head, and drawing on the everlasting gloves, declared with great vehemence that, come what might, he would go to dinner that very minute. Carrying this resolution into instant effect, he had advanced as far as the passage, when the sound of the latch-key in the street door caused him to make a precipitate retreat into his own office again. "Here he is," growled Newman, "and somebody with him. Now, it'll be stop till the gentleman's gone, but I won't. That's flat." So saying, Newman slipped into a tall empty closet which opened with 2 half-doors, and shut himself up, intending to slip out directly Ralph was inside his own room. "Noggs!" cried Ralph. "Where is that fellow Noggs?" But not a word said Newman. "The dog has gone to his dinner, though I told him not," muttered Ralph, looking into the office and pulling out his watch. "Ah, you better come in here, Gride. My man's out, and the sun is hot upon my room. This is cool and in the shade, if you don't mind roughing it."
"Not at all, Mr. Nickleby. Oh, not at all. All places are alike to me, sir. Ah, very nice indeed. Oh, very nice."
The person who made this reply was a little old man of about 70 or 75 years of age, of a very lean figure, much bent and slightly twisted. He wore a grey coat with a very narrow collar, an old-fashioned waistcoat of ribbed black silk, and such scanty trousers as displayed his shrunken spindle shanks in their full ugliness. The only articles of display or ornament in his dress were a steel watch-chain to which were attached some large gold seals, and a black ribbon into which, in compliance with an old fashion scarcely ever observed in these days, his grey hair was gathered behind. His nose and chin were sharp and prominent, his jaws had fallen inwards from loss of teeth, his face was shrivelled and yellow, save where the cheeks were streaked with the colour of a dry winter apple, and where his beard had been, there lingered yet a few grey tufts, which seemed, like the ragged eyebrows, to denote the badness of the soil from which they sprung. The whole air and attitude of the form was one of stealthy, cat-like obsequiousness. The whole expression of the face was concentrated in a wrinkled leer, compounded of cunning, lecherousness, slyness, and avarice. Such was old Arthur Gride, in whose face there was not a wrinkle, in whose dress there was not one spare fold or plait, but expressed the most covetous and griping penury, and sufficiently indicated his belonging to that class of which Ralph Nickleby was a member. Such was old Arthur Gride as he sat on a low chair looking up into the face of Ralph Nickleby, who, lounging upon the tall office stool with his arms upon his knees, looked down into his, a match for him on whatever errand he had come.
"And how have you been?"
said Gride, feigning great interest in Ralph's state of health.
"I haven't seen you for, not
for a long time," said Ralph with a peculiar smile, importing that he very well knew that it was not a mere visit of compliment that his friend had come. "It was a narrow chance that you saw me now, for I had only just come to the door as you turned the corner."
"I'm very lucky,"
observed Gride. "So men say," replied Ralph dryly. The older money-lender wagged his chin and smiled, but he originated no new remark, and they sat for some little time without speaking. Each was looking out to take the other at a disadvantage. "Come, Gride," said Ralph at length, "what's in the wind to-day?"
"Ah, you're a bold man, Mr. Nickleby,"
cried the other, apparently very much relieved by Ralph's leading the way to business.
"Oh, dear, what a bold man you are!"
"Why, you have a sleek and slinking way with you that makes me seem so by contrast," returned Ralph. "I don't know but that yours may answer better, but I want the patience for it."
"You were born a genius, Mr. Nickleby,"
said old Arthur.
"Deep, deep, deep. Ah!"
"Deep enough," retorted Ralph, "to know that I shall need all the depth I have when men like you begin to compliment. You know I have stood by when you fawned and flattered other people, and I remember pretty well what that always led to." rejoined Arthur, rubbing his hands.
So you do, no doubt. Not a man knows it better. Well, it's a pleasant thing now to think that you remembered old times. Oh, dear!"
"Now then," said Ralph composedly, "what's in the wind? I ask again. What is it?"
"See that now!"
cried the other.
"He can't even keep from business while we're chatting over bygones. Oh, dear, what a man it is!"
"Which of the bygones do you want to revive?" said Ralph. "One of them, I know, or you wouldn't talk about them."
"He suspects even me!"
cried old Arthur, holding up his hands.
"Even me! Oh, dear, even me! What a man it is! What a man it is! Mr. Nickleby against all the world. There's nobody like him. A giant among pygmies. A giant.
Ralph looked at the old dog with a quiet smile as he chuckled on in this strain, and Newman Noggs in the closet felt his heart sink within him as the prospect of dinner grew fainter and fainter.
"I must humour him, though," cried old Arthur. "He must have his way. A wilful man, as the Scotch say. Well, they're a wise people, the Scotch. He will talk about business, and won't give away his time for nothing. He's very right. Time is money. Time is money."
"He was one of us who made that saying, I should think," said Ralph. "Time is money, and very good money too, to those who reckon interest by it. Time is money. Yes, and time Costs money. It's rather an expensive article to some people we could name, or I forget my trade." In rejoinder to this sally, old Arthur again raised his hands, again chuckled, and again ejaculated,
"What a man it is!"
which done, he dragged the low chair a little nearer to Ralph's high stool, and looking upwards into his immovable face, said,
"What would you say to me if I was to tell you that I was going to be married?"
"I should tell you," replied Ralph, looking coldly down upon him, "that for some purpose of your own you told a lie, and that it wasn't the first time, and wouldn't be the last, that I wasn't surprised and wasn't to be taken in."
"Then I tell you seriously that I am,"
said old Arthur. "And I tell you seriously," rejoined Ralph, "what I told you this minute. Stay. Let me look at you. There's a liquorish devilry in your face. What is this?"
"I wouldn't deceive you, you know,"
whined Arthur Gride.
"I couldn't do it. I should be mad to try. Aye, to deceive Mr. Nickleby. A pygmy to impose upon the giant. I ask again, what should you say to me if I was to tell you that I was going to be married?"
"To some old hag," said Ralph.
No,
cried Arthur, interrupting him and rubbing his hands in an ecstasy.
Wrong again. Mr. Nickleby for once at fault. Out, quite out, to a young and beautiful girl. Fresh, lovely, bewitching, and not 19. Dark eyes, long eyelashes, ripe and ruddy lips that to look at is to long to kiss, beautiful clustering hair that one's fingers itch to play with, such a waist as might make a man clasp the air involuntarily, thinking of twining his arm about it, little feet that tread so lightly they hardly seem to walk upon the ground. To marry all this, hey?
"This is something more than common drivelling," said Ralph, after listening with a curled lip to the old sinner's raptures. "The girl's name?"
"Oh, deep. See now how deep that is," exclaimed old Arthur. "He knows I want his help. He knows he can give it me. He knows it must all turn to his advantage. He sees the thing already. Her name. Is there nobody within hearing?"
"Why, who the devil should there be?" retorted Ralph testily.
"I didn't know, but perhaps somebody might be passing up or down the stairs," said Arthur Gride, after looking out at the door and carefully reclosing it. "Or but that your man might have come back and might have been listening outside. Clerks and servants have a trick of listening, and I should have been very uncomfortable if Mr. Noggs—"
"Curse Mr. Noggs," said Ralph sharply, "and go on with what you have to say."
"Curse Mr. Noggs by all means," rejoined old Arthur. "I am sure I have not the least objection to that. Her name is—"
"Well," said Ralph, rendered very irritable by old Arthur's pausing again, "what is it?"
"Madeline Bray."
Whatever reasons there might have been, and Arthur Gride appeared to have anticipated some, for the mention of this name producing an effect upon Ralph, or whatever effect it really did produce upon him, he permitted none to manifest itself, but calmly repeated the name several times, as if reflecting when and where he had heard it before. "Bray," said Ralph. "Bray. There was a young Bray of— No, he never had a daughter."
"You remember Bray?" rejoined Arthur Gride.
"No," said Ralph, looking vacantly at him.
"Not Walter Bray, the dashing man who used his handsome wife so ill?"
If you seek to recall any particular dashing man to my recollection by such a trait as that," said Ralph, shrugging his shoulders, "I shall confound him with 9/10 of the dashing men I have ever known."
"That Bray who is now in the rules of the bench," said old Arthur. "You can't have forgotten Bray. Both of us did business with him. Why, he owes you money."
"Oh, him!" rejoined Ralph. "Aye, aye. Now you speak. Oh, it's his daughter, is it?" Naturally as this was said, it was not said so naturally but that a kindred spirit like old Arthur Gride might have discerned a design upon the part of Ralph to lead him on to much more explicit statements and explanations that he would have volunteered, or that Ralph could in all likelihood have obtained by any other means. Old Arthur, however, was so intent upon his own designs that he suffered himself to be overreached and had no suspicion but that his good friend was in earnest.
"I knew you couldn't forget him when you came to think for a moment," he said.
"You are right," answered Ralph. "But old Arthur Gride and matrimony is a most anomalous conjunction of words. Old Arthur Gride and dark eyes and eyelashes and lips that to look at is to long to kiss, and clustering hair that he wants to play with, and waists that he wants to span, and little feet that don't tread upon anything. Old Arthur Gride and such things as these is more monstrous still. But old Arthur Gride marrying the daughter of a ruined, dashing man in the rules of the bench is the most monstrous and incredible of all. Plainly, friend Arthur Gride, if you want any help from me in this business, which of course you do, or you would not be here, speak out, and to the purpose. And above all, don't talk to me of its turning to my advantage, for I know it must turn to yours also, and to a good round tune too, or you would have no finger in such a pie as this." There was enough acerbity and sarcasm not only in the matter of Ralph's speech, but in the tone of voice in which he uttered it, and the looks with which he eked it out, to have fired even the ancient usurer's cold blood and flushed even his withered cheek. But he gave vent to no demonstration of anger, contenting himself with exclaiming, as before,
"What a man it is!"
and rolling his head from side to side as if in unrestrained enjoyment of his freedom and drollery. Clearly observing, however, from the expression in Ralph's features that he had best come to the point as speedily as might be, he composed himself for more serious business and entered upon the pith and marrow of his negotiation. First, he dwelt upon the fact that Madeline Bray was devoted to the support and maintenance, and was a slave to every wish of her only parent, who had no other friend on earth. To which Ralph rejoined that he had heard something of the kind before, and that if she had known a little more of the world she wouldn't have been such a fool. Secondly, he enlarged upon the character of her father, arguing that even taking it for granted that he loved her in return with the utmost affection of which he was capable, yet he loved himself a great deal better, which Ralph said it was quite unnecessary to say anything more about, as that was very natural and probable enough. And thirdly, old Arthur premised that the girl was a delicate and beautiful creature, and that he had really a hankering to have her for his wife. To this Ralph deigned no other rejoinder than a harsh smile and a glance at the shrivelled old creature before him, which were, however, sufficiently expressive.
"Now," said Gride, "for the little plan I have in my mind to bring this about. Because I haven't offered myself even to the father yet, I should have told you. But that you have gathered already. Oh dear, what an edged tool you are!"
"Don't play with me, then," said Ralph impatiently. "You know the proverb."
"A reply always on the tip of his tongue,"
cried old Arthur, raising his hands and eyes in admiration.
"He is always prepared. Oh dear, what a blessing to have such a ready wit and so much ready money to back it."
Then suddenly changing his tone, he went on,
"I've been backwards and forwards to Bray's lodgings several times within the last 6 months. It is just half a year since I first saw this delicate morsel, and oh dear, what a delicate morsel it is! But that is neither here nor there. I am his detaining creditor, for £1,700.
You talk as if you were the only detaining creditor, said Ralph, pulling out his pocket-book. I am another for £975 4 and threepence.
The only other, Mr. Nickleby,
said old Arthur eagerly. The
only other. Nobody else went to the expense of lodging a detainer, trusting to our holding him fast enough, I warrant you. We both fell into the same snare. Oh, dear, what a pitfall it was. It almost ruined me, and lent him our money upon bills, with only one name besides his own, which, to be sure, everybody's supposed to be a good one, and was as negotiable as money, but which turned out you know how. Just as we should have come upon him, he died insolvent. Ah, it went very nigh to ruin me, that loss did.
Go on with your scheme, said Ralph. It's of no use raising the cry of our trade just now. There's nobody to hear us.
It's always as well to talk that way, returned old Arthur with a chuckle, whether there's anybody to hear us or not. Practice makes perfect, you know. Now, if I offer myself to Bray as his son-in-law, upon one simple condition, at the moment I am fast married he shall be quietly released, and have an allowance to live just t'other side the water like a gentleman. He can't live long, for I've asked his doctor, and he declares that his complaint is one of the heart, and it is impossible. And if all the advantages of this condition are properly stated and dwelt upon to him, do you think he could resist me? And if he could not resist me, do you think his daughter could resist him? Shouldn't I have her, Mrs. Arthur Gride, pretty Mrs. Arthur Gride, a titbit, a dainty chick? Shouldn't I have her, Mrs. Arthur Gride, in a week, a month, a day, any time I chose to name?
Go on, said Ralph, nodding his head deliberately, and speaking in a tone whose studied coldness presented a strange contrast to the rapturous squeak to which his friend had gradually mounted. Go on. You didn't come here to ask me that.
Oh, dear, how you talk, cried old Arthur, edging himself closer still to Ralph. Of course I didn't. I don't pretend I did. I came to ask what you would take from me if I prospered with the father for this debt of yours. 5 shillings in the pound, 6 and 8pence, 10 shillings. I would go as far as 10 for such a friend as you. We've always been on such good terms, but you won't be so hard upon me as that, I know. Now, will you?
There's something more to be told, said Ralph, as stony and immovable as ever.
Yes, yes, there is, but you won't give me time, returned Arthur Gride. I want a backer in this matter, one who can talk and urge and press a point which you can do as no man can. I can't do that, for I am a poor, timid, nervous creature. Now, if you get a good composition for this debt which you long ago gave up for lost, you'll stand my friend and help me, won't you?
There's something more, said Ralph.
No, no, indeed,
cried Arthur Gride. Yes, yes, indeed. I tell you, yes, said Ralph.
Oh,
returned old Arthur, feigning to be suddenly enlightened.
Oh, you mean something more as concerns myself and my intention. Oh, aye, surely, surely. Shall I mention that?
I think you had better, rejoined Ralph dryly.
I didn't like to trouble you with that, because I supposed your interest would cease with your own concern in the affair, said Arthur Gride. That's kind of you to ask. Oh, dear, how very kind of you. Why, Supposing I had a knowledge of some property, some little property, very little, to which this pretty chick was entitled, which nobody does or can know of at this time, but which her husband could sweep into his pouch if he knew as much as I do, would that account for—"
"For the whole proceeding," rejoined Ralph abruptly. "Now, let me turn this matter over and consider what I ought to have if I should help you to success."
"Oh, but don't be hard!"
cried old Arthur, raising his hands with an imploring gesture and speaking in a tremulous voice.
"Don't be too hard upon me. It's a very small property. It is indeed. Say the 10 shillings, and we'll close the bargain. It's more than I ought to give, but you're so kind. Shall we say the 10? Do now, do."
Ralph took no notice of these supplications, but sat for 3 or 4 minutes in a brown study, looking thoughtfully at the person from whom they proceeded. After sufficient cogitation he broke silence, and it certainly could not be objected that he used any needless circumlocution or failed to speak directly to the purpose. "If you married this girl without me," said Ralph, "you must pay my debt in full, because you couldn't set her father free otherwise. It's plain, then, that I must have the whole amount, clear of all deduction or encumbrance, or I should lose from being honoured with your confidence instead of gaining by it. That's the first article of the treaty. For the second, I shall stipulate that for my trouble in negotiation and persuasion and helping you to this fortune, I have £500. That's very little, because you have the ripe lips and the clustering hair and what not, all to yourself. For the third and last article, I require that you execute a bond to me this day, binding yourself in the payment of these 2 sums before noon of the day of your marriage with Madeline Bray. You have told me I can urge and press a point. I press this one, and will take nothing less than these terms. Accept them if you like. If not, marry her without me if you can. I shall still get my debt." To all entreaties, protestations, and offers of compromise between his own proposals and those of which Arthur Gride had first suggested, Ralph was as deaf as an adder. He would enter into no further discussion of the subject, and while old Arthur dilated upon the enormity of his demands and proposed modifications of them, approaching by degrees nearer and nearer to the terms he resisted, sat perfectly mute, looking with an air of quiet abstraction over the entries and papers in his pocket-book. Finding that it was impossible to make any impression upon his staunch friend, Arthur Gride, who had prepared himself for some such result before he came, consented with a heavy heart to the proposed treaty, and upon the spot filled up the bond required (Ralph kept such instruments handy), after exacting the condition that Mr. Nickleby should accompany him to Bray's lodgings that very hour and open the negotiation at once, should circumstances appear auspicious and favourable to their designs. In pursuance of this last understanding, the worthy gentlemen went out together shortly afterwards, and Newman Noggs emerged, bottle in hand, from the cupboard, out of the upper door of which, at the imminent risk of detection, he had more than once thrust his red nose when such parts of the subject were under discussion as interested him most. "I have no appetite now," said Newman, putting the flask in his pocket. "I've had my dinner." Having delivered this observation in a very grievous and doleful tone, Newman reached the door in one long limp and came back again in another. "I don't know who she may be or what she may be," he said, "but I pity her with all my heart and soul, and I can't help her. Nor can I any of the people against whom 100 tricks, but none so vile as this, are plotted every day. Well, that adds to my pain, but not to theirs. The thing is no worse, because I know it, and it tortures me as well as them. Gride and Nickleby, good pair for a curricle. Oh, roguery, roguery, roguery!" With these reflections and a very hard knock on the crown of his unfortunate hat at each repetition of the last word, Newman Noggs, whose brain was a little muddled by so much of the contents of the pocket pistol as had found their way there during his recent concealment, went forth to seek such consolation as might be derivable from the beef and greens of some cheap eating-house. Meanwhile, the 2 plotters had betaken themselves to the same house whither Nicholas had repaired for the first time but a few mornings before. and having obtained access to Mr. Bray and found his daughter from home, had by a train of the most masterly approaches that Ralph's utmost skill could frame, at length laid open the real object of their visit. "There he sits, Mr. Bray," said Ralph, as the invalid, not yet recovered from his surprise, reclined in his chair, looking alternately at him and Arthur Gride. "What if he has had the ill fortune to be one cause of your detention in this place? I have been another. Men must live. You are too much a man of the world not to see that in its true light. We offer the best reparation in our power. Reparation. Here is an offer of marriage that many a titled father would leap at for his child. Mr. Arthur Gride, with the fortune of a prince. Think what a haul it is."
"My daughter, sir," returned Bray haughtily, "as I have brought her up, would be a rich recompense for the largest fortune that a man could bestow in exchange for her hand."
"Precisely what I told you," said the artful Ralph, turning to his friend old Arthur. "Precisely what made me consider the thing so fair and easy. There is no obligation on either side. You have money, and Miss Madeline has beauty and worth. She has youth, you have money. She has not money, you have not youth. Tit for tats, quits, a match of heaven's own making."
"Matches are made in heaven, they say," added Arthur Gride, leering hideously at the father-in-law he wanted. "If we are married, it will be destiny, according to that."
"Then think, Mr. Bray," said Ralph, hastily substituting for this argument considerations more nearly allied to earth, "think what a stake is involved in the acceptance or rejection of these proposals of my friend."
"How can I accept or reject?"
interrupted Mr. Bray with an irritable consciousness that it really rested with him to decide.
"It is for my daughter to accept or reject. It is for my daughter. You know that."
"True," said Ralph emphatically, "but you have still the power to advise, to state the reasons for and against, to hint a wish."
"To hint a wish, sir?"
returned the debtor, proud and mean by turns, and selfish at all times.
"I am her father, am I not? Why should I hint and beat about the bush? Do you suppose, like her mother's friends and my enemies, a curse upon them all, that there is anything in what she has done for me but duty, sir, but duty? Or do you think that my having been unfortunate is a sufficient reason why our relative positions should be changed, and that she should command and I should obey? Hint a wish, too, perhaps you think, because you see me in this place and scarcely able to leave this chair without assistance, that I am some broken-spirited, dependent creature, without the courage or power to do what I may think best for my own child. Still the power to hint a wish. I hope so."
"Pardon me," returned Ralph, who thoroughly knew his man and had taken his ground accordingly. "You do not hear me out. I was about to say that your hinting a wish, even hinting a wish, would surely be equivalent to commanding."
"Why, of course it would," retorted Mr. Bray in an exasperated tone. "If you don't happen to have heard of the time, sir, I tell you that there was a time when I carried every point in triumph against her mother's whole family, although they had power and wealth on their side, by my will alone."
"Still," rejoined Ralph, as mildly as his nature would allow him, "you have not heard me out. You are a man yet qualified to shine in society, with many years of life before you. That is, if you lived in freer air, and under brighter skies, and chose your own companions. Gaiety is your element. You have shone in it before. Fashion and freedom for you, France, and an annuity that would support you there in luxury, would give you a new lease of life, would transfer you to a new existence. The town rang with your expensive pleasures once, and you could blaze up on a new scene again, profiting by experience and living a little at others' cost, instead of letting others live at yours. What is there on the reverse side of the picture? What is there? I don't know which is the nearest churchyard, but a gravestone there wherever it is, and a date, perhaps 2 years hence, perhaps 20. That's all." Mr. Bray rested his elbow on the arm of his chair and shaded his face with his hand. "I speak plainly," said Ralph, sitting down beside him, "because I feel strongly. It's my interest that you should marry your daughter to my friend Gride, because then he sees me paid, in part, that is. I don't disguise it. I acknowledge it openly. But what interest have you in recommending her to such a step? Keep that in view. She might object, remonstrate, shed tears, talk of his being too old, and plead that her life would be rendered miserable. But what is it now?" Several slight gestures on the part of the invalid showed that these arguments were no more lost upon him than the smallest iota of his demeanour was upon Ralph. "What is it now, I say?" pursued the wily usurer. "Or what has it a chance of being? If you died, indeed, the people you hate would make her happy. But can you bear the thought of that?" "No," returned Bray, urged by a vindictive impulse he could not repress. "I should imagine not indeed," said Ralph quietly. "If she profits by anybody's death," this was said in a lower tone, "let it be by her husband's. Don't let her have to look back to yours as the event from which to date a happier life. Where is the objection? Let me hear it stated. What is it? That her suitor is an old man? Why, how often do men of family and fortune who haven't your excuse but have all the means and superfluities of life within their reach, how often do they marry their daughters to old men, or, worse still, to young men without heads or hearts, to tickle some idle vanity, strengthen some family interest, or secure some seat in Parliament? Judge for her, sir, judge for her. You must know best, and she will live to thank you." "Hush! Hush!" cried Mr. Bray, suddenly starting up and covering Ralph's mouth with his trembling hand. "I hear her at the door." There was a gleam of conscience in the shame and terror of this hasty action, which in one short moment tore the thin covering of sophistry from the cruel design and laid it bare in all its meanness and heartless deformity. The father fell into his chair pale and trembling. Arthur Gride plucked and fumbled at his hat and durst not raise his eyes from the floor. Even Ralph crouched for the moment like a beaten hound, cowed by the presence of one young innocent girl. The effect was almost as brief as sudden. Ralph was the first to recover himself, and observing Madeline's looks of alarm, entreated the poor girl to be composed, assuring her that there was no cause for fear. "A sudden spasm," said Ralph, glancing at Mr. Bray. "He is quite well now." It might have moved a very hard and worldly heart to see the young and beautiful creature, whose certain misery they had been contriving but a minute before, throw her arms about her father's neck and pour forth words of tender sympathy and love, the sweetest a father's ear can know or child's lips form. But Ralph looked coldly on, and Arthur Gride, whose bleared eyes gloated only over the outward beauties and were blind to the spirit which reigned within, evinced a fantastic kind of warmth, certainly, but not exactly that kind of warmth of feeling which the contemplation of virtue usually inspires. "Madeline," said her father, gently disengaging himself, "it was nothing."
"But you had that spasm yesterday, and it is terrible to see you in such pain. Can I do nothing for you?"
Nothing just now. Here are two gentlemen, Madeline, one of whom you have seen before. She used to say," added Mr. Bray, addressing Arthur Gride, "that the sight of you always made me worse. That was natural, knowing what she did, and only what she did, of our connexion and its results. Well, perhaps she may change her mind on that point. Girls have leave to change their minds, you know. You are very tired, my dear."
"I am not, indeed."
"Indeed you are. You do too much."
"I wish I could do more."
"I know you do, but you overtask your strength. This wretched life, my love, of daily labour and fatigue is more than you can bear. I am sure it is, poor Madeline." With these and many more kind words,
Mr. Bray drew his daughter to him and kissed her cheek affectionately. Ralph, watching him sharply and closely in the meantime, made his way towards the door and signed to Gride to follow him. "You will communicate with us again?" said Ralph. "Yes, yes," returned Mr. Bray, hastily thrusting his daughter aside. "In a week. Give me a week." "1 week," said Ralph, turning to his companion. "From to-day. Good morning. Miss Madeline, I kiss your hand." "We will shake hands, Gride," said Mr. Bray, extending his, as old Arthur bowed. "You mean well, no doubt. I am bound to say so now. If I owed you money, that was not your fault. Madeline, my love, your hand here."
Oh, dear! If the young lady would condescend. Only the tips of her fingers,
said Arthur, hesitating and half retreating. Madeline shrunk involuntarily from the goblin figure, but she placed the tips of her fingers in his hand and instantly withdrew them. After an ineffectual clutch, intended to detain and carry them to his lips, old Arthur gave his own fingers a mumbling kiss, and with many amorous distortions of visage went in pursuit of his friend, who was by this time in the street.
"What does he say? What does he say? What does the giant say to the pygmy?"
inquired Arthur Gride, hobbling up to Ralph. "What does the pygmy say to the giant?" rejoined Ralph, elevating his eyebrows and looking down upon his questioner.
"He doesn't know what to say," replied Arthur Gride. "He hopes and fears. But is she not a dainty morsel?"
"I have no great taste for beauty," growled Ralph.
"But I have,"
rejoined Arthur, rubbing his hands.
"Oh, dear, how handsome her eyes looked when she was stooping over him! Such long lashes, such delicate fringe. She looked at me so soft."
"Not over lovingly, I think," said Ralph. "Did she?"
"No, you think not," replied old Arthur. "But don't you think it can be brought about? Don't you think it can?"
Ralph looked at him with a contemptuous frown and replied with a sneer and between his teeth, "Did you mark his telling her she was tired and did too much and overtasked her strength?"
"Aye, aye. What of it?"
"When do you think he ever told her that before? The life is more than she can bear. Yes, yes, he'll change it for her."
"Do you think it's done?"
inquired old Arthur, peering into his companion's face with half-closed eyes. "I am sure it's done," said Ralph. "He is trying to deceive himself even before our eyes already. He is making believe that he thinks of her good and not his own. He is acting a virtuous part, and so considerate and affectionate, sir, that the daughter scarcely knew him. I saw a tear of surprise in her eye. There'll be a few more tears of surprise there before long, though of a different kind. Now, we may wait with confidence for this day week." End of chapter 47. Of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 48. Being for the benefit of Mr. Vincent Crummles, and positively his last appearance on this stage. It was with a very sad and heavy heart, oppressed by many painful ideas, that Nicholas retraced his steps eastward and betook himself to the counting-house of Cheeryble Brothers, whatever the idle hopes he had suffered himself to entertain, whatever the pleasant visions which had sprung up in his mind and grouped themselves round the fair image of Madeline Bray, they were now dispelled, and not a vestige of their gaiety and brightness remained. It would be a poor compliment to Nicholas's better nature, and one which he was very far from deserving, to insinuate that the solution, and such a solution, of the mystery which had seemed to surround Madeline Bray when he was ignorant even of her name, had damped his ardour or cooled the fervour of his admiration. If he had regarded her before with such a passion as young men attracted by mere beauty and elegance may entertain, he was now conscious of much deeper and stronger feelings. But reverence for the truth and purity of her heart, respect for the helplessness and loneliness of her situation, sympathy with the trials of one so young and fair, and admiration of her great and noble spirit, all seemed to raise her far above his reach, and, while they imparted new depth and dignity to his love, to whisper that it was hopeless. "I will keep my word as I have pledged it to her," said Nicholas manfully. "This is no common trust that I have to discharge, and I will perform the double duty that is imposed upon me most scrupulously and strictly. My secret feelings deserve no consideration in such a case as this, and they shall have none." Still, there were the secret feelings in existence just the same, and in secret Nicholas rather encouraged them than otherwise, reasoning, if he reasoned at all, that there they could do no harm to anybody but himself, and that if he kept them to himself from a sense of duty, he had an additional right to entertain himself with them as a reward for his heroism. All these thoughts, coupled with what he had seen that morning and the anticipation of his next visit, rendered him a very dull and abstracted companion. So much so, indeed, that Tim Linkinwater suspected he must have made the mistake of a figure somewhere which was preying upon his mind, and seriously conjured him, if such were the case, to make a clean breast and scratch it out, rather than have his whole life embittered by the tortures of remorse. But in reply to these considerate representations, and many others both from Tim and Mr. Frank, Nicholas could only be brought to state that he was never merrier in his life, and so went on all day, and so went towards home at night, still turning over and over again the same subjects, thinking over and over again the same things, and arriving over and over again at the same conclusions. In this pensive, wayward, and uncertain state, people are apt to lounge and loiter without knowing why, to read placards on the walls with great attention and without the smallest idea of one word of their contents, and to stare most earnestly through shop windows at things which they don't see. It was thus that Nicholas found himself poring with the utmost interest over a large playbill hanging outside a minor theatre, which he had to pass on his way home, and reading a list of the actors and actresses who had promised to do honour to some approaching benefit, with as much gravity as if it had been a catalogue of the names of those ladies and gentlemen who stood highest upon the book of fate, and he had been looking anxiously for his own. He glanced at the top of the bill, with a smile at his own dulness, as he prepared to resume his walk, and there saw announced in large letters with a large space between each of them, positively the last appearance of Mr. Vincent Crummles of provincial celebrity. "Nonsense," said Nicholas, turning back again. "It can't be." But there it was. In one line by itself was an announcement of the first night of a new melodrama. In another line by itself was an announcement of the last 6 nights of an old one. A third line was devoted to the re-engagement of the unrivalled African knife-swallower, who had kindly suffered himself to be prevailed upon to forego his country engagements for 1 week longer. A fourth line announced that Mr. Snittle Timberry, having recovered from his late severe indisposition, would have the honour of appearing that evening. A fifth line said that there were cheers, tears, and laughter every night. A sixth, that was positively the last appearance of Mr. Vincent Crummles of provincial celebrity. Surely it must be the same man, thought Nicholas. There can't be 2 Vincent Crummleses. The better to settle this question, he referred to the bill again, and finding that there was a baron in the first piece, and that Roberto, his son, was enacted by one Master Crummles, and Spilletro, his nephew, by one Master Percy Crummles, their last appearance, and that incidental to the piece was a characteristic dance by the characters and a castanet pas seul by the infant phenomenon, her last appearance, he no longer entertained any doubt, and presenting himself at the stage door and sending in a scrap of paper with Mr. Johnson written thereon in pencil, was presently conducted by a robber with a very large belt and buckle round his waist and very large leather gauntlets on his hands into the presence of his former manager. Mr. Crummles was unfeignedly glad to see him, and starting up from before a small dressing-glass with one very bushy eyebrow stuck on crooked over his left eye and the fellow eyebrow and the calf of one of his legs in his hand, embraced him cordially, at the same time observing that it would do Mrs. Crummles's heart good to bid him good-bye before they went. "You were always a favourite of hers, Johnson," said Crummles. "Always were from the first. I was quite easy in my mind about you from that first day you dined with us. One that Mrs. Crummles took a fancy to was sure to turn out right. Ah, Johnson, what a woman that is!" "I am sincerely obliged to her for her kindness in this and all other respects," said Nicholas. "But where are you going that you talk about bidding good-bye?" "Haven't you seen it in the papers?" said Crummles with some dignity. "No," replied Nicholas. "I wonder at that," said the manager. "It was among the varieties. I had the paragraph here somewhere, but I don't know. Oh, yes, here it is." So saying, Mr. Crummles, after pretending that he thought he must have lost it, produced a square inch of newspaper from the pocket of the pantaloons he wore in private life, which, together with the plain clothes of several other gentlemen, lay scattered about on a kind of dresser in the room, and gave it to Nicholas to read. The talented Vincent Crummles, long favourably known to fame as country manager and actor of no ordinary pretensions, is about to cross the Atlantic on a histrionic expedition. Crummles is to be accompanied, we hear, by his lady and gifted family. We know no man superior to Crummles in this particular line of character, or one who, whether as a public or private individual, could carry with him the best wishes of a larger circle of friends. Crummles is certain to succeed. "Here's another bit," said Mr. Crummles, handing over a still smaller scrap. "This is from the notices to correspondence, this one." Nicholas read it aloud. "Philo Dramaticus Crummles, the country manager and actor, cannot be more than 43 or 44 years of age. Crummles is not a Prussian, having been born at Chelsea." Said Nicholas. "That's an odd paragraph." "Very," returned Crummles, scratching the side of his nose and looking at Nicholas with an assumption of great unconcern. "I can't think who put these things in. I didn't." Still keeping his eye on Nicholas, Mr. Crummles shook his head twice or thrice with profound gravity, and remarking that he could not for the life of him imagine how the newspapers found out the things they did, folded up the extracts and put them in his pocket again. "I'm astonished to hear this news," said Nicholas. "Going to America! You had no such thing in contemplation when I was with you." "No," replied Crummles, "I hadn't then. The fact is that Mrs. Crummles, most extraordinary woman, Johnson." Here he broke off and whispered something in his ear. "Oh!" said Nicholas, smiling. "The prospect of an addition to your family." "The 7th addition, Johnson," returned Mr. Crummles solemnly. "I thought such a child as the phenomenon must have been a closer, but it seems we are to have another. She is a very remarkable woman." "I congratulate you," said Nicholas, "and I hope this may prove a phenomenon too." "Why, it's pretty sure to be something uncommon, I suppose," rejoined Mr. Crummles. "The talent of the other three is principally in combat and serious pantomime. I should like this one to have a turn for juvenile tragedy. They understand they want something of that sort in America very much. However, we must take it as it comes. Perhaps it may have a genius for the tightrope. It may have any sort of genius, in short, if it takes after its mother, Johnson, for she is an universal genius. But whatever its genius is, that genius shall be developed." Expressing himself after these terms, Mr. Crummles put on his other eyebrow and the calves of his legs, and then put on his legs, which were of a yellowish flesh colour and rather soiled about the knees, from frequent going down upon these joints in curses, prayers, last struggles, and other strong passages. While the ex-manager completed his toilet, he informed Nicholas that as he should have a fair start in America from the proceeds of a tolerably good engagement which he had been fortunate enough to obtain, and as he and Mrs. Crummles could scarcely hope to act for ever, not being immortal, except in the breath of fame and in a figurative sense, he had made up his mind to settle there permanently, in the hope of acquiring some land of his own which would support them in their old age, and which they could afterwards bequeath to their children. Nicholas having highly commended the resolution, Mr. Crummles went on to impart such further intelligence relative to their mutual friends as he thought might prove interesting, informing Nicholas, among other things, that Miss Snevellicci was happily married to an affluent young wax chandler who had supplied the theatre with candles, and that Mr. Lillyvick didn't dare to say his soul was his own, such was the tyrannical sway of Mrs. Lillyvick, who reigned paramount and supreme. Nicholas responded to this confidence on the part of Mr. Crummles by confiding to him his own name, situation, and prospects, and informing him in as few general words as he could of the circumstances which had led to their first acquaintance. After congratulating him with great heartiness on the improved state of his fortunes, Mr. Crummles gave him to understand that next morning he and his were to start for Liverpool, where the vessel lay which was to carry them from the shores of England, and that if Nicholas wished to take a last adieu of Mrs. Crummles, he must repair with him that night to a farewell supper given in honour of the family at a neighbouring tavern, at which Mr. Snittle Timberry would preside, while the honours of the vice-chair would be sustained by the African Swallower. The room being by this time very warm and somewhat crowded, in consequence of the influx of 4 gentlemen who had just killed each other in the piece under representation, Nicholas accepted the invitation and promised to return at the conclusion of the performances, preferring the cool air and twilight out of doors to the mingled perfume of gas, orange peel, and gunpowder which pervaded the hot and glaring theatre. He availed himself of this interval to buy a silver snuff-box, the best his funds could afford, as a token of remembrance for Mr. Crummles, and having purchased besides a pair of earrings for Mrs. Crummles, a necklace for the phenomenon, and a flaming shirt-pin for each of the young gentlemen, he refreshed himself with a walk, and returning a little after the appointed time, found the lights out, the theatre empty, the curtain raised for the night, and Mr. Crummles walking up and down the stage, expecting his arrival. "Tinberry won't be long," said Mr. Crummles. "He played the audience out to-night. He does a faithful black in the last piece, and it takes him a little longer to wash himself." "A very unpleasant line of character, I should think," said Nicholas. "No, I don't know," replied Mr. Crummles. "It comes off easily enough, and there's only the face and neck. We had a first tragedy man in our company once who, when he played Othello, used to black himself all over. But that's feeling a part and going into it as if you meant it. It isn't usual, more's the pity." Mr. Snittle Timberry now appeared, arm in arm with the African Swallower, and, being introduced to Nicholas, raised his hat half a foot and said he was proud to know him. The Swallower said the same, and looked and spoke remarkably like an Irishman. "I see by the bills that you have been ill, sir," said Nicholas to Mr. Timberry. "I hope you are none the worse for your exertions to-night." Mr. Timberry, in reply, shook his head with a gloomy air, tapped his chest several times with great significancy, and drawing his cloak more closely about him, said, "But no matter, no matter. Come." It is observable that when people upon the stage are in any strait involving the very last extremity of weakness and exhaustion, they invariably perform feats of strength requiring great ingenuity and muscular power. Thus, a wounded prince or bandit chief who is bleeding to death and too faint to move, except to the softest music, and then only upon his hands and knees, shall be seen to approach a cottage door for aid in such a series of writhings and twistings, and with such curlings up of the legs, and such rollings over and over, and such gettings up and tumblings down again, as could never be achieved save by a very strong man skilled in posture-making. And so natural did this sort of performance come to Mr. Snittle Timberry, that on their way out of the theatre and towards the tavern where the supper was to be holden, he testified the severity of his recent indisposition and its wasting effects upon the nervous system by a series of gymnastic performances which were the admiration of all witnesses. "Why, this is indeed a joy I had not looked for," said Mrs. Crummles when Nicholas was presented. "Nor I," replied Nicholas. "It is by a mere chance that I have this opportunity of seeing you, although I would have made a great exertion to have availed myself of it." "Here is one whom you know," said Mrs. Crummles, thrusting forward the phenomenon in a blue gauze frock, extensively flounced, and trousers of the same. "And here another, and another," presenting the Master Crummleses. "And how is your friend, the faithful Digby?" "Digby?" said Nicholas, forgetting at the instant that this had been Smike's theatrical name. "Oh, yes, he's quite what am I saying? He is very far from well." "How?" exclaimed Mrs. Crummles with a tragic recoil. "I fear," said Nicholas, shaking his head and making an attempt to smile, "that your better half would be more struck with him now than ever." "What mean you?" rejoined Mrs. Crummles in her most popular manner. "Whence comes this altered tone?" "I mean that a dastardly enemy of mine has struck at me through him, and that while he thinks to torture me, he inflicts on him such agonies of terror and suspense as you'll excuse me, I am sure," said Nicholas, checking himself. "I should never speak of this, and never do, except to those who know the facts, but for a moment I forgot myself." With this hasty apology, Nicholas stooped down to salute the phenomenon and changed the subject, inwardly cursing his precipitation and very much wondering what Mrs. Crummles must think of so sudden an explosion. That lady seemed to think very little about it, for the supper being by this time on table, she gave her hand to Nicholas and repaired with a stately step to the left hand of Mr. Snittle Timberry. Nicholas had the honour to support her, and Mr. Crummles was placed upon the chairman's right. The phenomenon and the Master Crummleses sustained the vice. The company amounted in number to some 25 or 30, being composed of such members of the theatrical profession then engaged or disengaged in London as were numbered among the most intimate friends of Mr. and Mrs. Crummles. The ladies and gentlemen were pretty equally balanced, the expenses of the entertainment being defrayed by the latter, each of whom had the privilege of inviting one of the former as his guest. It was upon the whole a very distinguished party, for independently of the lesser theatrical lights who clustered on this occasion round Mr. Snittle Timberry, there was a literary gentleman present who had dramatized in his time 247 novels as fast as they had come out, some of them faster than they had come out, and who was a literary gentleman in consequence. This gentleman sat on the left hand of Nicholas, to whom he was introduced by his friend the African Swallower from the bottom of the table with a high eulogium upon his fame and reputation. "I am happy to know a gentleman of such great distinction," said Nicholas politely. "Sir," replied the wit, "you're very welcome, I'm sure. The honour is reciprocal, sir, as I usually say when I dramatize a book. Did you ever hear a definition of fame, sir?" "I have heard several," replied Nicholas with a smile. "What is yours?" "When I dramatize a book, sir," said the literary gentleman, "that's fame for its author." "Oh, indeed?" rejoined Nicholas. "That's fame, sir," said the literary gentleman. "So Richard Turpin, Tom King, and Jerry Abershaw have handed down to fame the names of those on whom they committed their most impudent robberies?" said Nicholas. "I don't know anything about that, sir," answered the literary gentleman. "Shakespeare dramatized stories which had previously appeared in print, it is true," observed Nicholas. "Meaning Bill, sir?" said the literary gentleman. "So he did. Bill was an adapter, certainly, so he was, and very well he adapted too, considering." "I was about to say," rejoined Nicholas, "that Shakespeare derived some of his plots from old tales and legends in general circulation, but it seems to me that some of the gentlemen of your craft at the present day have shot very far beyond him." "You're quite right, sir," interrupted the literary gentleman, leaning back in his chair and exercising his toothpick. "Human intellect, sir, has progressed since his time, is progressing, will progress." "Shot beyond him, I mean," resumed Nicholas, "in quite another respect. For, whereas he brought within the magic circle of his genius traditions peculiarly adapted for his purpose and turned familiar things into constellations which should enlighten the world for ages, you drag within the magic circle of your dullness subjects not at all adapted to the purposes of the stage and debase as he exalted. For instance, you take the uncompleted books of living authors, fresh from their hands, wet from the press, cut, hack, and carve them to the powers and capacities of your actors and the capabilities of your theatres, finish unfinished works hastily, and crudely vamp up ideas not yet worked out by their original projector, but which have doubtless cost him many thoughtful days and sleepless nights, by a comparison of incidents and dialogue, down to the very last word he may have written a fortnight before, do your utmost to anticipate his plot. All this without his permission and against his will. And then, to crown the whole proceeding, publish in some mean pamphlet an unmeaning farrago of garbled extracts from his work, to which your name as author, with the honourable distinction annexed, of having perpetrated 100 other outrages of the same description. Now, show me the distinction between such pilfering as this and picking a man's pocket in the street, unless indeed it be that the legislature has a regard for pocket-handkerchiefs and leaves men's brains, except when they are knocked out by violence, to take care of themselves." "Men must live, sir," said the literary gentleman, shrugging his shoulders. "That would be an equally fair plea in both cases," replied Nicholas. "But if you put it upon that ground, I have nothing more to say than that if I were a writer of books and you a thirsty dramatist, I would rather pay your tavern score for 6 months, large as it might be, than have a niche in the temple of fame with you for the humblest corner of my pedestal through 600 generations." The conversation threatened to take a somewhat angry tone when it had arrived thus far, but Mrs. Crummles opportunely interposed to prevent its leading to any violent outbreak by making some inquiries of the literary gentleman relative to the plots of the 6 new pieces which he had written by contract to introduce the African knife-swallower in his various unrivalled performances. This speedily engaged him in an animated conversation with that lady, in the interest of which all recollection of his recent discussion with Nicholas very quickly evaporated. The board being now clear of the more substantial articles of food, and punch, wine, and spirits being placed upon it and handed about, the guests who had been previously conversing in little groups of 3 or 4 gradually fell off into a dead silence, while the majority of those present glanced from time to time at Mr. Snittle Timberry, and the bolder spirits did not even hesitate to strike the table with their knuckles and plainly intimate their expectations by uttering such encouragements as, "Now, Tim," "Wake up, Mr. Chairman," "All charged, sir, and waiting for a toast," and so forth. To these remonstrances Mr. Timberry deigned no other rejoinder than striking his chest and gasping for breath, and giving many other indications of being still the victim of indisposition, for a man must not make himself too cheap, either on the stage or off, while Mr. Crummles, who knew full well that he would be the subject of the forthcoming toast, sat gracefully in his chair with his arm thrown carelessly over the back, and now and then lifted his glass to his mouth and drank a little punch, with the same air with which he was accustomed to take long draughts of nothing out of the pasteboard goblets in banquet scenes. At length Mr. Snittle Timberry rose in the most approved attitude, with one hand in the breast of his waistcoat and the other on the nearest snuff-box, and having been received with great enthusiasm, proposed, with abundance of quotations, his friend Mr. Vincent Crummles, ending a pretty long speech by extending his right hand on one side and his left on the other, and severally calling upon Mr. and Mrs. Crummles to grasp the same. This done, Mr. Vincent Crummles returned thanks, and that done, the African Swallower proposed Mrs. Vincent Crummles in affecting terms. Then were heard loud moans and sobs from Mrs. Crummles and the ladies, despite of which that heroic woman insisted upon returning thanks herself, which she did in a manner and in a speech which has never been surpassed and seldom equalled. It then became the duty of Mr. Snittle Timberry to give the young Crummleses, which he did, after which Mr. Vincent Crummles, as their father, addressed the company in a supplementary speech, enlarging on their virtues, amiabilities, and excellences, and wishing that they were the sons and daughter of every lady and gentleman present. These solemnities having been succeeded by a decent interval, enlivened by musical and other entertainments, Mr. Crummles proposed that ornament of the profession, the African swallower, his very dear friend, if he would allow him to call him so, which liberty, there being no particular reason why he should not allow it, the African swallower graciously permitted. The literary gentleman was then about to be drunk, but it being discovered that he had been drunk for some time in another acceptation of the term and was then asleep on the stairs, the intention was abandoned and the honour transferred to the ladies. Finally, after a very long sitting, Mr. Snittle Timberry vacated the chair, and the company, with many adieux and embraces, dispersed. Nicholas waited to the last to give his little presents. When he had said good-bye all round and came to Mr. Crummles, he could not but mark the difference between their present separation and their parting at Portsmouth. Not a jot of his theatrical manner remained. He put out his hand with an air which, if he could have summoned it at will, would have made him the best actor of his day in homely parts, and when Nicholas shook it with the warmth he honestly felt, appeared thoroughly melted. "We were a very happy little company, Johnson," said poor Crummles. "You and I never had a word. I shall be very glad to-morrow morning to think that I saw you again, but now I almost wish you hadn't come." Nicholas was about to return a cheerful reply when he was greatly disconcerted by the sudden apparition of Mrs. Grudden, who, it seemed, had declined to attend the supper in order that she might rise earlier in the morning, and who now burst out of an adjoining bedroom, habited in very extraordinary white robes, and throwing her arms about his neck, hugged him with great affection. "What? Are you going too?" said Nicholas, submitting with as good a grace as if she had been the finest young creature in the world. "Going?" returned Mrs. Grudden. "Lor' mercy, what do you think they'd do without me?" Nicholas submitted to another hug with even a better grace than before, if that were possible, and waving his hat as cheerfully as he could, took farewell of the Vincent Crummleses. Chapter 48. Chapter 49 of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 49 chronicles the further proceedings of the Nickleby family and the sequel of the adventure of the gentleman in the small clothes. While Nicholas, absorbed in the one engrossing subject of interest which had recently opened upon him, occupied his leisure hours with thoughts of Madeline Bray, and in execution of the commissions which the anxiety of brother Charles in her behalf imposed upon him, saw her again and again, and each time with greater danger to his peace of mind and a more weakening effect upon the lofty resolutions he had formed, Mrs. Nickleby and Kate continued to live in peace and quiet, agitated by no other cares than those which were connected with certain harassing proceedings taken by Mr. Snawley for the recovery of his son, and their anxiety for Smike himself, whose health, long upon the wane, began to be so much affected by apprehension and uncertainty as sometimes to occasion both them and Nicholas considerable uneasiness and even alarm. It was no complaint or murmur on the part of the poor fellow himself that thus disturbed them. Ever eager to be employed in such slight services as he could render, and always anxious to repay his benefactors with cheerful and happy looks, less friendly eyes might have seen in him no cause for any misgiving. But there were times, and often too, when the sunken eye was too bright, the hollow cheek too flushed, the breath too thick and heavy in its course, the frame too feeble and exhausted to escape their regard and notice. There is a dread disease which so prepares its victim, as it were, for death, which so refines it of its grosser aspect, and throws around familiar looks, unearthly indications of the coming change, a dread disease in which the struggle between soul and body is so gradual, quiet, and solemn, and the result so sure, that day by day and grain by grain the mortal part wastes and withers away, so that the spirit grows light and sanguine with its lightening load, and, feeling immortality at hand, deems it but a new term of mortal life, a disease in which death and life are so strangely blended that death takes the glow and hue of life, and life the gaunt and grisly form of death, a disease which medicine never cured, wealth never warded off, or poverty could boast exemption from, which sometimes moves in giant strides, and sometimes at a tardy sluggish pace, but, slow or quick, is ever sure and certain. It was with some faint reference in his own mind to this disorder, though he would by no means admit it even to himself, that Nicholas had already carried his faithful companion to a physician of great repute. There was no cause for immediate alarm, he said. There were no present symptoms which could be deemed conclusive. The constitution had been greatly tried and injured in childhood, but still it might not be, and that was all. But he seemed to grow no worse, and as it was not difficult to find a reason for these symptoms of illness in the shock and agitation he had recently undergone, Nicholas comforted himself with the hope that his poor friend would soon recover. This hope his mother and sister shared with him, and as the object of their joint solicitude seemed to have no uneasiness or despondency for himself, but each day answered with a quiet smile that he felt better than he had upon the day before, their fears abated, and the general happiness was by degrees restored. Many and many a time in after years did Nicholas look back to this period of his life, and tread again the humble, quiet, homely scenes that rose up as of old before him. Many and many a time, in the twilight of a summer evening, or beside the flickering winter's fire, but not so often or so sadly then, would his thoughts wander back to these old days, and dwell with a pleasant sorrow upon every slight remembrance which they brought crowding home. The little room in which they had so often sat, long after it was dark, figuring such happy futures, Kate's cheerful voice and merry laugh, how, if she were from home, they used to sit and watch for her return, scarcely breaking silence, but to say how dull it seemed without her. The glee with which poor Smike would start from the darkened corner where he used to sit and hurry to admit her, and the tears they often saw upon his face, half wondering to see them too, and he so pleased and happy, every little incident and even slight words and looks of those old days little heeded then, but well remembered when busy cares and trials were quite forgotten, came fresh and thick before him many and many a time, and, rustling above the dusty growth of years, came back green boughs of yesterday. But there were other persons associated with these recollections, and many changes came about before they had being. A necessary reflection for the purpose of these adventures, which at once subside into their accustomed train, and shunning all flighty anticipations or wayward wanderings, pursue their steady and decorous course. If the brothers Cheeryble, as they found Nicholas worthy of trust and confidence, bestowed upon him every day some new and substantial mark of kindness, they were not less mindful of those who depended on him. Various little presents to Mrs. Nickleby, always of the very things they most required, tended in no slight degree to the improvement and embellishment of the cottage. Kate's little store of trinkets became quite dazzling, and for company, if brother Charles and brother Ned failed to look in for at least a few minutes every Sunday or one evening in the week, there was Mr. Tim Linkinwater, who had never made half a dozen other acquaintances in all his life, and who took such delight in his new friends as no words can express, constantly coming and going in his evening walks and stopping to rest, while Mr. Frank Cheeryble happened, by some strange conjunction of circumstances, to be passing the door on some business or other at least 3 nights in the week.
"He is the most attentive young man I ever saw, Kate,"
said Mrs. Nickleby to her daughter one evening, when this last-named gentleman had been the subject of the worthy lady's eulogium for some time, and Kate had sat perfectly silent.
"Attentive, mamma,"
rejoined Kate.
"Bless my heart, Kate!"
cried Mrs. Nickleby with her wonted suddenness.
"What a colour you have got! Why, you're quite flushed!"
"Oh, mamma, what strange things you fancy!"
"It wasn't fancy, Kate, my dear, I'm certain of that,"
returned her mother.
"However, it's gone now at any rate, so it don't much matter whether it was or not. What was it we were talking about? Oh, Mr. Frank, I never saw such attention in my life, never."
"Surely you are not serious?" returned Kate, colouring again, and this time beyond all dispute.
"Not serious?" returned Mrs. Nickleby. "Why shouldn't I be serious? I'm sure I never was more serious. I will say that his politeness and attention to me is one of the most becoming, gratifying, pleasant things I've seen for a very long time. You don't often meet with such behaviour in young men, and it strikes one more when one does meet with it."
"Oh, attention to you, mamma," rejoined Kate quickly. "Oh, yes."
"Dear me, Kate," retorted Mrs. Nickleby, "what an extraordinary girl you are! Was it likely I should be talking of his attention to anybody else? I declare I'm quite sorry to think you should be in love with a German lady. That I am."
"He said very positively that it was no such thing, mamma," returned Kate. "Don't you remember his saying so that very first night he came here? Besides," she added in a more gentle tone, "why should we be sorry if it is the case? What is it to us, mamma?"
"Nothing to us, Kate, perhaps," said Mrs. Nickleby emphatically, "but something to me, I confess. I like English people to be thorough English people, and not half English and half I don't know what. I shall tell him point blank next time he comes that I wish he would marry one of his own countrywomen, and see what he says to that."
"Oh, pray don't think of such a thing, mamma," returned Kate hastily. "Not for the world. Consider how very—"
"Well, my dear, how very what?"
said Mrs. Nickleby, opening her eyes in great astonishment. Before Kate had returned any reply, a queer little double knock announced that Miss La Creevy had called to see them. And when Miss La Creevy presented herself, Mrs. Nickleby, though strongly disposed to be argumentative on the previous question, forgot all about it in a gush of supposes upon the coach she had come by, supposing that the man who drove must have been either the man in the shirt-sleeves or the man with the black eye, that whoever he was he hadn't found that parasol she left inside last week, and that no doubt they had stopped a long while at the half-way house coming down, or that perhaps being full they had come straight on, and lastly that they surely must have passed Nicholas on the road.
"I saw nothing of him," answered Miss La Creevy, "but I saw that dear old soul, Mr. Linkinwater."
"Taking his evening walk and coming on to rest here before he turns back to the city, I'll be bound," said Mrs. Nickleby.
"I should think he was,"
returned Miss La Creevy,
"especially as young Mr. Cheeryble was with him."
"Surely that is no reason why Mr. Linkinwater should be coming here?" said Kate.
"Why, I think it is, my dear," said Miss La Creevy. "For a young man, Mr. Frank is not a very good walker, and I observe that he generally falls tired and requires a good long rest when he has come as far as this. But where is my friend?"
said the little woman, looking about, after having glanced slyly at Kate.
"He has not been run away with again, has he? Ah, where is Mr. Smike?" said Mrs. Nickleby. "He was here this instant."
Upon further inquiry, it turned out, to the good lady's unbounded astonishment, that Smike had, that moment, gone upstairs to bed.
"Well, now," said Mrs. Nickleby, "he is the strangest creature. Last Tuesday, was it Tuesday? Yes, to be sure it was. You recollect, Kate, my dear, the very last time young Mr. Cheeryble was here. Last Tuesday night he went off in just the same strange way, at the very moment the knock came to the door. It cannot be that he don't like company, because he is always fond of people who are fond of Nicholas, and I am sure young Mr. Cheeryble is. And the strangest thing is that he does not go to bed. Therefore it cannot be because he is tired. I know he doesn't go to bed because my room is the next one, and when I went upstairs last Tuesday hours after him, I found that he had not even taken his shoes off, and he had no candle, so he must have sat moping in the dark all the time. Now, upon my word," said Mrs. Nickleby, "when I come to think of it, that's very extraordinary."
As the hearers did not echo this sentiment, but remained profoundly silent, either as not knowing what to say or as being unwilling to interrupt, Mrs. Nickleby pursued the thread of her discourse after her own fashion.
"I hope," said that lady, "that this unaccountable conduct may not be the beginning of his taking to his bed and living there all his life like the thirsty woman of Tutbury, or the Cock Lane ghost, or some of those extraordinary creatures. One of them had some connexion with our family. I forget, without looking back to some old letters I have upstairs, whether it was my great-grandfather who went to school with the Cock Lane ghost, or the thirsty woman of Tutbury who went to school with my grandmother. Miss Nickleby, you know, of course. Which was it that didn't mind what the clergyman said, the Cock Lane ghost or the thirsty woman of Tutbury? The Cock Lane ghost, I believe. Then I have no doubt, said Mrs. Nickleby, that it was with him my great-grandfather went to school, for I know the master of his school was a dissenter, and that would in a great measure account for the Cock Lane ghost's behaving in such an improper manner to the clergyman when he grew up. Ah, train up a ghost, child, I mean.
Any further reflections on this fruitful theme were abruptly cut short by the arrival of Tim Linkinwater and Mr. Frank Cheeryble, in the hurry of receiving whom Mrs. Nickleby speedily lost sight of everything else.
"I'm so sorry Nicholas is not at home," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Kate, my dear, you must be both Nicholas and yourself."
"Miss Nickleby need be but herself," said Frank. "I, if I may venture to say so, oppose all change in her."
"Then at all events she shall press you to stay," returned Mrs. Nickleby. "Mr. Linkinwater says 10 minutes, but I cannot let you go so soon. Nicholas would be very vexed, I am sure. Kate, my dear."
In obedience to a great number of nods and winks and frowns of extra significance, Kate added her entreaties that the visitors would remain. But it was observable that she addressed them exclusively to Tim Linkinwater, and there was besides a certain embarrassment in her manner which, although it was as far from impairing its graceful character as the tinge it communicated to her cheek was from diminishing her beauty, was obvious at a glance even to Mrs. Nickleby. Not being of a very speculative character, however, save under circumstances where her speculations could be put into words and uttered aloud, that discreet matron attributed the emotion to the circumstance of her daughter's not happening to have her best frock on, though I never saw her look better, certainly, she reflected at the same time. Having settled the question in this way, and being most complacently satisfied that in this and in all other instances her conjecture could not fail to be the right one, Mrs. Nickleby dismissed it from her thoughts and inwardly congratulated herself on being so shrewd and knowing. Nicholas did not come home, nor did Smike reappear, but neither circumstance, to say the truth, had any great effect upon the little party, who were all in the best humour possible. Indeed, there sprang up quite a flirtation between Miss Nickleby and Tim Linkinwater, who said 1,000 jocose and facetious things and became by degrees quite gallant, not to say tender. Little Miss Nickleby, on her part, was in high spirits and rallied Tim on having remained a bachelor all his life with so much success that Tim was actually induced to declare that if he could get anybody to have him, he didn't know but what he might change his condition even yet. Miss Nickleby earnestly recommended a lady she knew who would exactly suit Mr. Linkinwater and had a very comfortable property of her own, but this latter qualification had very little effect upon Tim, who manfully protested that fortune would be no object with him, but that true worth and cheerfulness of disposition were what a man should look for in a wife, and that if he had these he could find money enough for the moderate wants of both. This avowal was considered so honourable to Tim that neither Mrs. Nickleby nor Miss Nickleby could sufficiently extol it, and stimulated by their praises, Tim launched out into several other declarations, also manifesting the disinterestedness of his heart and a great devotion to the fair sex, which were received with no less approbation. This was done and said with a comical mixture of jest and earnest, and, leading to a great amount of laughter, made them very merry indeed. Kate was commonly the life and soul of the conversation at home, but she was more silent than usual upon this occasion, perhaps because Tim and Miss Nickleby engrossed so much of it, and, keeping aloof from the talkers, sat at the window watching the shadows as the evening closed in, and enjoying the quiet beauty of the night, which seemed to have scarcely less attractions to Frank, who first lingered near and then sat down beside her. No doubt there are a great many things to be said appropriate to a summer evening, and no doubt they are best said in a low voice, as being most suitable to the peace and serenity of the hour. Long pauses, too, at times, and then an earnest word or so, and then another interval of silence, which, somehow, does not seem like silence either, and perhaps now and then a hasty turning away of the head or drooping of the eyes towards the ground. All these minor circumstances, with a disinclination to have candles introduced and a tendency to confuse hours with minutes, are doubtless mere influences of the time, as many lovely lips can clearly testify. Neither is there the slightest reason why Mrs. Nickleby should have expressed surprise when, candles being at length brought in, Kate's bright eyes were unable to bear the light, which obliged her to avert her face and even to leave the room for some short time, because, when one has sat in the dark so long, candles are dazzling, and nothing can be more strictly natural than that such results should be produced, as all well-informed young people know. For that matter, old people know it too, or did know it once, but they forget these things sometimes, and more's the pity. The good lady's surprise, however, did not end here. It was greatly increased when it was discovered that Kate had not the least appetite for supper, a discovery so alarming that there is no knowing in what unaccountable efforts of oratory Mrs. Nickleby's apprehensions might have been vented if the general attention had not been attracted, at the moment, by a very strange and uncommon noise, proceeding, as the pale and trembling servant-girl affirmed, and as everybody's sense of hearing seemed to affirm also, right down the chimney of the adjoining room. It being quite plain to the comprehension of all present that, however extraordinary and improbable it might appear, the noise did nevertheless proceed from the chimney in question, and the noise, which was a strange compound of various shuffling, sliding, rumbling, and struggling sounds, all muffled by the chimney, still continuing, Frank Cheeryble caught up a candle, and Tim Linkinwater the tongs, and they would have very quickly ascertained the cause of this disturbance if Mrs. Nickleby had not been taken very faint and declined being left behind on any account. This produced a short remonstrance, which terminated in their all proceeding to the troubled chamber in a body, excepting only Miss La Creevy, who, as the servant-girl volunteered a confession of having been subject to fits in her infancy, remained with her to give the alarm and apply restoratives in case of extremity. Advancing to the door of the mysterious apartment, they were not a little surprised to hear a human voice, chanting with a highly elaborated expression of melancholy, and in tones of suffocation which a human voice might have produced from under 5 or 6 feather beds of the best quality, the once popular air of "Has she then failed in her truth, the beautiful maid I adore?" Nor, on bursting into the room without demanding a parley, was their astonishment lessened by the discovery that these romantic sounds certainly proceeded from the throat of some man up the chimney, of whom nothing was visible but a pair of legs, which were dangling above the grate, apparently feeling, with extreme anxiety, for the top bar whereon to effect a landing. A sight so unusual and unbusinesslike as this completely paralysed Tim Linkinwater, who, after 1 or 2 gentle pinches at the stranger's ankles, which were productive of no effect, stood clapping the tongs together as if he were sharpening them for another assault, and did nothing else. "This must be some drunken fellow," said Frank. "No thief would announce his presence thus." As he said this, with great indignation, he raised the candle to obtain a better view of the legs, and was darting forward to pull them down with very little ceremony when Mrs. Nickleby, clasping her hands, uttered a sharp sound, something between a scream and an exclamation, and demanded to know whether the mysterious limbs were not clad in small clothes and grey worsted stockings, or whether her eyes had deceived her. "Yes," cried Frank, looking a little closer. "Small clothes, certainly, and rough grey stockings too. Do you know him, ma'am?"
"Kate, my dear,"
said Mrs. Nickleby, deliberately sitting herself down in a chair with that sort of desperate resignation which seemed to imply that now matters had come to a crisis, and all disguise was useless,
"you will have the goodness, my love, to explain precisely how this matter stands. I have given him no encouragement, none whatever, not the least in the world. You know that, my dear, perfectly well. He was very respectful, exceedingly respectful, when he declared, as you were a witness to. Still, at the same time, if I am to be persecuted in this way, if vegetable what's-his-names and all kinds of garden stuff are to strew my path out of doors, and gentlemen are to come choking up our chimneys at home, I really don't know, upon my word I do not know, what is to become of me. It's a very hard case, harder than anything I was ever exposed to before I married your poor dear papa, though I suffered a good deal of annoyance then. But that, of course, I expected and made up my mind for. When I was not nearly so old as you, my dear, there was a young gentleman who sat next us at church, who used almost every Sunday to cut my name in large letters in the front of his pew while the sermon was going on. It was gratifying, of course, naturally so, but still it was an annoyance because the pew was in a very conspicuous place, and he was several times publicly taken out by the beadle for doing it. But that was nothing to this.
This is a great deal worse and a great deal more embarrassing. I would rather, Kate, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby with great solemnity and an effusion of tears, "I would rather, I declare, have been a pig-faced lady than be exposed to such a life as this." Frank Cheeryble and Tim Linkinwater looked in irrepressible astonishment, first at each other and then at Kate, who felt that some explanation was necessary, but who, between her terror at the apparition of the legs, her fear lest their owner should be smothered, and her anxiety to give the least ridiculous solution of the mystery that it was capable of bearing, was quite unable to utter a single word. "He gives me great pain," continued Mrs. Nickleby, drying her eyes, "great pain. But don't hurt a hair of his head, I beg. On no account hurt a hair of his head." It would not, under existing circumstances, have been quite so easy to hurt a hair of the gentleman's head as Mrs. Nickleby seemed to imagine, inasmuch as that part of his person was some feet up the chimney, which was by no means a wide one. But as all this time he had never left off singing about the bankruptcy of the beautiful maid in respect of truth, and now began not only to croak very feebly, but to kick with great violence, as if respiration became a task of difficulty, Frank Cheeryble, without further hesitation, pulled at the shorts and worsteds with such heartiness as to bring him floundering into the room with greater precipitation than he had quite calculated upon. "Oh, yes, yes," said Kate directly the whole figure of this singular visitor appeared in this abrupt manner. "I know who it is. Pray don't be rough with him. Is he hurt? I hope not. Oh, pray see if he is hurt." "He is not, I assure you," replied Frank, handling the object of his surprise, after this appeal, with sudden tenderness and respect. "He is not hurt in the least." "Don't let him come any nearer," said Kate, retiring as far as she could. "Oh, no, he shall not," rejoined Frank. "You see, I have him secure here. But may I ask you what this means, and whether you expected this old gentleman?" "Oh, no," said Kate. "Of course not. But he Mamma does not think so, I believe. But he is a mad gentleman who has escaped from the next house and must have found an opportunity of secreting himself here." "Kate," interposed Mrs. Nickleby with severe dignity, "I am surprised at you." "Dear mamma," Kate gently remonstrated. "I am surprised at you," repeated Mrs. Nickleby. "Upon my word, Kate, I am quite astonished that you should join the persecutors of this unfortunate gentleman when you know very well that they have the basest designs upon his property and that that is the whole secret of it. It would be much kinder of you, Kate, to ask Mr. Linkinwater or Mr. Cheeryble to interfere in his behalf and see him righted. You ought not to allow your feelings to influence you. It's not right, very far from it. What should my feelings be, do you suppose, if anybody ought to be indignant? Who is it? I, of course, and very properly so. Still, at the same time, I wouldn't commit such an injustice for the world. No," continued Mrs. Nickleby, drawing herself up and looking another way with a kind of bashful stateliness. "This gentleman will understand me when I tell him that I repeat the answer I gave him the other day, that I always will repeat it, though I do believe him to be sincere when I find him placing himself in such dreadful situations on my account, and that I request him to have the goodness to go away directly, or it will be impossible to keep his behaviour a secret from my son Nicholas. I am obliged to him, very much obliged to him, but I cannot listen to his addresses for a moment. It's quite impossible." While this address was in course of delivery, the old gentleman, with his nose and cheeks embellished with large patches of soot, sat upon the ground with his arms folded, eyeing the spectators in profound silence and with a very majestic demeanour. He did not appear to take the smallest notice of what Mrs. Nickleby said, but when she ceased to speak, he honoured her with a long stare and inquired if she had quite finished. "I have nothing more to say," replied that lady modestly. "I really cannot say anything more." "Very good," said the old gentleman, raising his voice. "Then bring in the bottled lightning, a clean tumbler, and a corkscrew." Nobody executing this order, the old gentleman, after a short pause, raised his voice again and demanded a thunder sandwich. This article not being forthcoming either, he requested to be served with a fricassee of boot-tops and goldfish sauce, and then, laughing heartily, gratified his hearers with a very long, very loud, and most melodious bellow.
But still Mrs. Nickleby, in reply to the significant looks of all about her, shook her head as though to assure them that she saw nothing whatever in all this, unless indeed it were a slight degree of eccentricity. She might have remained impressed with these opinions down to the latest moment of her life, but for a slight train of circumstances which, trivial as they were, altered the whole complexion of the case. It happened that Miss La Creevy, finding her patient in no very threatening condition, and being strongly impelled by curiosity to see what was going forward, bustled into the room while the old gentleman was in the very act of bellowing. It happened, too, that the instant the old gentleman saw her, he stopped short, skipped suddenly on his feet, and fell to kissing his hand violently, a change of demeanour which almost terrified the little portrait painter out of her senses and caused her to retreat behind Tim Linkinwater with the utmost expedition. "Ah-ha!" cried the old gentleman, folding his hands and squeezing them with great force against each other. "I see her now! I see her now! My love, my life, my bride, my peerless beauty! She has come at last, and all is gas and gaiters!" Mrs. Nickleby looked rather disconcerted for a moment, but immediately recovering, nodded to Miss La Creevy and the other spectators several times, and frowned, and smiled gravely, giving them to understand that she saw where the mistake was and would set it all to rights in a minute or two. "She is come," said the old gentleman, laying his hand upon his heart. "Cormoran and Blunderbore, she is come. All the wealth I have is hers if she will take me for her slave. Where are grace, beauty, and blandishments like those? In the Empress of Madagascar? No. In the Queen of Diamonds? No. In Mrs. Rowland, who every morning bathes in Calidore for nothing? No. Melt all these down into one with the 3 Graces, the 9 Muses, and 14 biscuit-bakers' daughters from Oxford Street, and make a woman half as lovely? Pho! I defy you!" After uttering this rhapsody, the old gentleman snapped his fingers 20 or 30 times and then subsided into an ecstatic contemplation of Miss La Creevy's charms. This affording Mrs. Nickleby a favourable opportunity of explanation, she went about it straight.
"I am sure," said the worthy lady with a prefatory cough, "that it's a great relief, under such trying circumstances as these, to have anybody else mistaken for me. A very great relief. And it's a circumstance that never occurred before, although I have several times been mistaken for my daughter Kate. I have no doubt the people were very foolish and perhaps ought to have known better, but still they did take me for her. And of course that was no fault of mine, and it would be very hard indeed if I was to be made responsible for it. However, in this instance, of course, I must feel that I should do exceedingly wrong if I suffered anybody, especially anybody that I am under great obligations to be made uncomfortable on my account, and therefore I think it my duty to tell that gentleman that he is mistaken, that I am the lady who he has told by some impertinent person was niece to the Council of Paving-Stones, and that I do beg and entreat of him to go quietly away if it's only for—" here Mrs. Nickleby simpered and hesitated, "for my sake." It might have been expected the old gentleman would have been penetrated to the heart by the delicacy and condescension of this appeal, and that he would at least have returned a courteous and suitable reply. What, then, was the shock which Mrs. Nickleby received when, accosting her in the most unmistakable manner, he replied in a loud and sonorous voice, "Avaunt, cat!" "Sir!" cried Mrs. Nickleby in a faint tone. "Cat!" repeated the old gentleman. "Puss! Kit! Tit! Grimalkin! Tabby! Brindle! Whoosh!" With which last sound, uttered in a hissing manner between his teeth, the old gentleman swung his arms violently round and round, and at the same time alternately advanced on Mrs. Nickleby and retreated from her in that species of savage dance with which boys on market days may be seen to frighten pigs, sheep, and other animals when they give out obstinate indications of turning down a wrong street. Mrs. Nickleby wasted no words, but uttered an exclamation of horror and surprise and immediately fainted away. "I'll attend to mamma," said Kate hastily. "I'm not at all frightened, but pray take him away. Pray take him away."
Frank was not at all confident of his power of complying with this request until he bethought himself of the stratagem of sending Miss La Creevy on a few paces in advance and urging the old gentleman to follow her. It succeeded to a miracle, and he went away in a rapture of admiration, strongly guarded by Tim Linkinwater on one side and Frank himself on the other.
"Kate," murmured Mrs. Nickleby, reviving when the coast was clear, "is he gone?"
She was assured that he was.
"I shall never forgive myself, Kate," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Never. That gentleman has lost his senses, and I am the unhappy cause."
"You the cause?" said Kate, greatly astonished.
"I, my love," replied Mrs. Nickleby with a desperate calmness. "You saw what he was the other day. You see what he is now. I told your brother weeks and weeks ago, Kate, that I hoped a disappointment might not be too much for him. You see what a wreck he is. Making allowance for his being a little flighty, you know how rationally and sensibly and honourably he talked when we saw him in the garden. You have heard the dreadful nonsense he has been guilty of this night, and the manner in which he has gone on with that poor unfortunate little old maid. Can anybody doubt how all this has been brought about?"
"I should scarcely think they could," said Kate mildly.
"I should scarcely think so either," rejoined her mother. "Well, if I am the unfortunate cause of this, I have the satisfaction of knowing that I am not to blame. I told Nicholas, I said to him, 'Nicholas, my dear, we should be very careful how we proceed.' He would scarcely hear me. If the matter had only been properly taken up at first, as I wished it to be, but you are both of you so like your poor papa. However, I have my consolation, and that should be enough for me." Washing her hands thus of all responsibility under this head, past, present, or to come, Mrs. Nickleby kindly added that she hoped her children might never have greater cause to reproach themselves than she had, and prepared herself to receive the escort, who soon returned with the intelligence that the old gentleman was safely housed and that they found his custodians, who had been making merry with some friends, wholly ignorant of his absence. Quiet being again restored, a delicious half-hour, so Frank called it, in the course of subsequent conversation with Tim Linkinwater as they were walking home, was spent in conversation, and Tim's watch at length apprising him that it was high time to depart, the ladies were left alone, though not without many offers on the part of Frank to remain until Nicholas arrived, no matter what hour of the night it might be, if, after the late neighbourly eruption, they entertained the least fear of being left to themselves. As their freedom from all further apprehension, however, left no pretext for his insisting on mounting guard, he was obliged to abandon the citadel and to retire with the trusty Tim. Nearly 3 hours of silence passed away. Kate blushed to find, when Nicholas returned, how long she had been sitting alone, occupied with her own thoughts.
"I really thought it had not been half an hour," she said.
"They must have been pleasant thoughts, Kate," rejoined Nicholas gaily, "to make time pass away like that. What were they now?" Kate was confused. She toyed with some trifle on the table, looked up and smiled, looked down, and dropped a tear.
"Why, Kate," said Nicholas, drawing his sister towards him and kissing her,
"let me see your face.
No?
Ah, that was but a glimpse. That's scarcely fair. A longer look than that, Kate. Come, and I'll read your thoughts for you." There was something in this proposition, albeit it was said without the slightest consciousness or application, which so alarmed his sister that Nicholas laughingly changed the subject to domestic matters, and thus gathered by degrees, as they left the room and went upstairs together, how lonely Smike had been all night, and by very slow degrees too, for on this subject also Kate seemed to speak with some reluctance.
"Poor fellow!" said Nicholas, tapping gently at his door. "What can be the cause of all this?"
Kate was hanging on her brother's arm. The door being quickly opened, she had no time to disengage herself before Smike, very pale and haggard and completely dressed, confronted them. "And have you not been to bed?" said Nicholas.
"No,"
was the reply. Nicholas gently detained his sister, who made an effort to retire, and asked, "Why not?"
"I could not sleep,"
said Smike, grasping the hand which his friend extended to him.
"You are not well?" rejoined Nicholas. "I am Better, indeed. A great deal better," said Smike quickly. "Then why do you give way to these fits of melancholy?" inquired Nicholas in his kindest manner. "Or why not tell us the cause? You grow a different creature, Smike." "I do. I know I do," he replied. "I will tell you the reason one day, but not now. I hate myself for this. You are all so good and kind, but I cannot help it. My heart is very full. You do not know how full it is." He wrung Nicholas's hand before he released it, and glancing, for a moment, at the brother and sister as they stood together, as if there were something in their strong affection which touched him very deeply, withdrew into his chamber and was soon the only watcher under that quiet roof. Chapter 49.